My landlord handed me a termination notice on a cold February morning, and he was smiling when I took it from his hand. 5 years later, I handed him one. That's the end of the story. But the middle is the part worth knowing. The shop had been my mother's before it was mine. She opened Birwood Press in a ground-floor commercial space on Grafton Street in Halifax when I was 11 years old, with a hand-me-down letterpress, 3 cases of antique type, and more stubbornness than sense. Or so she always said. She did custom wedding stationery, small-run poetry chapbooks for local writers, business cards for people who still believed that something made by hand said what a digital file never could. By the time I finished art school and came back to Halifax, the shop had a loyal following, a waiting list for wedding work, and a landlord named Harlan Oates, who cashed his rent checks every month without ever bothering to fix the heating unit that rattled all winter. My mother passed when I was 27. I kept the shop running because closing it felt like a second loss I wasn't ready for. My father, a retired Finnish carpenter who'd spent 30 years building cabinetry for other people's homes, helped me refit the back workroom. After a water line leaked through the ceiling, in my second year of running the place alone. He said the bones of the building were good. He said the man who owned it was not. Harlan Oates had inherited the Grafton Street properties from his father, who'd assembled them in the 1980s, when Halifax's downtown was still affordable enough for a private landlord to accumulate a small portfolio. By the time I was renting from him, Harlan owned 4 commercial buildings in the area, and he managed them through his son, who handled everything under the title of property manager. The property manager had a habit of returning maintenance requests marked under review for months at a time, and of being extraordinarily precise about lease language only when it worked in his father's favor. I'd been a tenant at that address for nearly 8 years, paying on time every month, not a single issue. My mother had been a tenant for 6 years before that, 14 years of unbroken rent flowing into the Oates family's account. When the termination notice arrived, the property manager brought it himself. He handed it across the counter without making eye contact, said the words Heritage Restoration Assessment, and left before I could ask anything. I read the letter 3 times standing between the press and the front window. On page 9 of my commercial lease, a document I had signed at 23, in a notary's office, while someone spoke quickly and told me the clauses were standard. There was a provision I had never looked at carefully. It said that in the event the building required a heritage structural assessment mandated by Halifax Municipal Heritage Planning Office, the landlord retained the right to issue a vacant possession notice with 60 days. The letter said the building had been flagged by the city's Heritage Properties Program for mandatory review, and that all ground-floor commercial tenants needed to vacate by the 1st of April. 60 days. I had 60 days. I asked the property manager for documentation, the heritage planning order, the assessment file, the name of the city inspector. He said it was all being coordinated through the city, and the details weren't his to share at this stage. I called the Halifax Heritage Properties office the next morning. It took 3 calls and 1 patient clerk to confirm that no heritage assessment had been initiated for that address. None. Not pending, not recently filed, not under any current review. The building was on the Heritage Registry as a contributing structure, which meant it had a small plaque on the front wall and couldn't be demolished without approval. That was the extent of it. There was no assessment. There was no inspection order. There had never been one. 6 weeks after I vacated, a national coffee chain opened in my exact space. Same square footage, same original windows I had dressed with letterpress samples and greenery for 8 years, same exposed brick I had photographed for the shop's social media dozens of times. They had put in a new counter and a branded menu board. That was the renovation. I stood on the sidewalk across the street one evening after their lights went on and looked at what 14 years of my family's work had been replaced with, and I felt something settle in me that wasn't grief and wasn't quite anger either. It was colder than both. It was a decision forming. I could have filed a complaint. In Nova Scotia, commercial tenants don't have the same protections as residential ones. The legislation is thinner, the remedies more limited, and a formal dispute would be expensive and slow. I knew this because I had looked it up in the weeks between the notice and the move, sitting at my father's kitchen table, with a glass of wine I wasn't actually drinking, reading provincial commercial tenancy statutes past midnight. My father sat across from me through all of it and didn't fill the silence. He had a way of listening that I had depended on my whole life. I moved Birwood Press into a smaller space 8 blocks away. Worse foot traffic, poor signage visibility, a perfectly adequate landlord, and a building that felt like none of the things the other one had. I spent the first 3 months just trying to hold revenue steady while absorbing the cost of the move and the weight of starting over somewhere that didn't feel like mine. But I started keeping records. Every rent receipt from Grafton Street going back to the beginning. Every email exchange with the property manager. Every version of the lease. The heritage clause annotated. My phone calls to the Heritage Properties office, logged with dates and names. I didn't know exactly what I was building toward. I only knew that a landlord who could manufacture a fake municipal process, bury the mechanism on page 9 of a lease, and displace a 14-year tenant to make room for a corporate client was not someone who had done it once. That kind of precision comes from practice. It took 4 months to find Miriam. She was a commercial lease litigator at a 2-person firm in Dartmouth. Offices above a marine supply shops, no receptionist, a reputation among small business owners for being the person who took the cases the larger firms had already declined. I met her on a Tuesday with a binder I'd spent weeks organizing. She read through everything in silence while I drank cold coffee and tried not to watch her face. When she looked up, she didn't say anything dramatic. She said, "He's done this before. That clause is too specific not to have been field tested." She was right. Over the following year, quietly and through a combination of public property records, commercial lease filings, and a network of former Oates tenants that Miriam assembled, through careful word of mouth, we identified 5 other small businesses displaced from Harlan's properties over 13 years. A Portuguese bakery that had operated in the same location for 19 years, a second-hand instrument shop, a printmaking co-op, a bookbinder who'd been in his space for over a decade, a women's consignment clothing store that had anchored its block since the early 90s. In every case, the displacement had come through a lease clause, heritage assessment, structural evaluation, mandated waterproofing remediation, and in every case, the space had been re-let to a chain business within 3 months. None of the assessments had been real. Not a single one was on file with any municipal or provincial authority. This wasn't opportunism. It was a system. Harlan had a lawyer who had been refining that lease language over many years, making each clause technically defensible on its face. The clauses didn't promise that an assessment would occur, only that the landlord could terminate if one were required. The fraud was in the claiming that one had been required when it had not. Proving it in court would take years, and what we would most likely win was a settlement that Harlan could pay out quietly and absorb without changing anything. Miriam and I talked about the legal options more than once. I didn't want a settlement. My father, when I told him where my thinking had gone, looked at me for a long moment across his kitchen table and said, "Then you have to own something he can't buy back from you." So I started building toward that. For the next 4.5 years, I ran the shop the way my mother always had. Lean, careful, quality first. But I also started chasing every contract I'd previously turned down out of exhaustion. Corporate account work, engraved letterhead for law firms, embossed stationery for boutique hotels, custom packaging for a regional food brand that needed something premium for a national retail launch. Wedding work in volumes I hadn't attempted before. I hired 1 part-time assistant, then 2, and found that the shop could grow without losing the things that made it worth growing. My partner, an accountant who worked long days for a mid-size firm and spent his evenings helping me model out spreadsheets rather than resting, believed in what I was doing without qualification. He wasn't angry the way I sometimes still was. He treated the whole thing like a project with a clear deliverable and a timeline, and that steadiness kept me from making decisions based on emotion when patience was the only thing that was actually going to work. Together with my father, who contributed the proceeds from selling my mother's workshop tools, a decision he made quietly and told me about after it was done, we formed a numbered holding company. The name had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with the shop, nothing Harlan Oates would recognize or connect to anything he knew. The other piece of it took longer to understand. Miriam was the one who first identified it clearly. Harlan had mortgaged 2 of his 4 commercial properties, including the Grafton Street building, some years earlier, to fund the acquisition of a warehouse property outside the city. The mortgage on Grafton Street had been held initially by a regional credit union, then transferred once in a portfolio sale. By the time we began tracking it carefully, the note sat with a smaller commercial credit union in New Brunswick, that had been working through distressed commercial real estate debt on its books for the better part of 2 years. The loan was technically performing. Harlan was making payments, but just barely. He'd taken on the tenant improvement allowance for the coffee chain as part of the deal, and it had eaten into his net return significantly. The building was carrying more debt than it could comfortably service if anything changed. The credit union wanted to reduce its commercial real estate exposure. Not urgently, but genuinely. A motivated seller with a performing but undersized note and a board that had decided to exit the asset class. 11 months of negotiation. 3 declined offers. 2 stretches where Miriam told me the deal was likely finished. One night, alone in my apartment at 2 in the morning, where I sat completely certain that I had miscalculated the entire thing, and that I was going to spend the rest of my career running a shop in a building that would never feel like the right one. I called my father the next morning. He said almost nothing useful and everything necessary. I called Miriam after and told her to go back with revised terms. Our holding company acquired the mortgage note on the Grafton Street building for 63 cents on the dollar. We didn't act immediately. The plan had always been patience, and we were close enough to the outcome that moving too quickly would have cost us everything. Miriam spent 6 weeks confirming the legal position was precisely what we believed it to be. My partner ran the numbers 4 more times. My father asked me once whether I was absolutely sure, and I said yes, and he nodded, and we moved on. When everything was confirmed and recorded and in order, I waited 2 more weeks, just to let it all settle, just to be certain nothing could come loose. Then Miriam sent the notice to Harlan Oates. He called the property manager within the hour, apparently. The property manager, trying to understand what he was looking at, called the number listed for the note holder. That number connected to Miriam's office line. She explained to him, in the calm and deliberate way she explained everything, that a holding company he had never heard of had acquired the underlying mortgage on the Grafton Street building, that this created specific and enforceable rights under the terms of the loan agreement, and that he should expect to receive formal correspondence shortly. Within the month, using the leverage of the note and the capital we had spent 4.5 years accumulating, our holding company completed the outright purchase of the building. The title transferred on a Thursday. I found out from Miriam by text message while I was setting type in the back of the shop, and I stood there for a moment with a compositing stick in my hand before I put it down carefully and went to sit outside on the front step. Harlan came to the shop on a Thursday afternoon 3 days after the papers were signed. Not through a lawyer, not by letter. He came himself, in a dark overcoat I recognized from the one time he had appeared in person during the eviction process. A brief appearance before leaving everything to the property manager. He came through the door and looked around at the letterpress, the type display, the paper samples along the wall, and then his eyes found me behind the counter. He said, "You're the one behind this." Not a question. "Yes," I said. He talked about the building the way people do when they've lost the kind of leverage they're used to relying on. He talked about his father finding that property in 1987, about what it had meant to hold on to it through difficult years, about the work of managing a portfolio across market changes. He was not aggressive. He was something I hadn't expected him to be, which was diminished. He looked like someone who had spent 72 hours understanding that a move he'd considered final had already been answered. I let him finish. Then I told him, in the same flat procedural language his property manager had used with me 5 years earlier, that the ownership transition would be handled professionally and that he would receive formal documentation of any changes to the existing arrangements. I watched him understand what that sentence meant, coming from me, in this context. He left without another word. The property manager left his father's business within 2 months. The lawyer who had drafted the heritage clause over many years quietly stopped returning Harlan's calls. With the Grafton Street ownership now on public record under our holding company, 3 of the 5 displaced tenants Miriam had identified filed formal complaints with Nova Scotia's commercial regulatory body. A municipal heritage officer, upon reviewing the documented misuse of heritage assessment language, referred the matter to bylaw enforcement. Harlan's remaining 3 properties came under review. None of this resolved quickly or cleanly. These things never do, no matter how clearly you imagined the resolution at midnight in your father's kitchen. But the accumulation of official attention meant that Harlan did not have a next move available to him. He had run out of the thing that had always protected him, which was invisibility. A few weeks after the sale closed, I received a letter from him, not from his lawyer. Handwritten, on plain stationery, with no letterhead. It was short. He said that what had been done to my family's tenancy had been wrong, that he had told himself for years, that it was legal, that it was business, that displaced tenants had options. He said that losing the building was the first time he had understood those choices as what they actually were, instead of what he'd needed them to be. He said he was sorry. I read it twice. I put it in the same binder as the original termination notice, behind the tab marked February. They belong together. One says what he did, and the other says what it cost him to admit it. The actual renovations took 8 months. Real ones. My father supervised personally, working with 2 tradespeople he had known for years, and they went through the building properly. The heating system that had rattled through 14 winters, the window frames that had never been properly sealed against the Atlantic cold, the back staircase that had needed attention since well before my mother first signed a lease there. They did it correctly. They took the time it required. When we were done, the building was in better condition than it had ever been, in the years either of us had occupied it. Birwood Press reopened on Grafton Street in October. We held an event, because my mother would have held an event, and because the people who had supported the shop through 5 years in the wrong building deserved to be there when it came back to the right one. My father stood in the doorway of the workroom the morning we reopened, running his hand slowly along the wooden frame he had refinished himself, and said it smelled like it used to. I took that as the highest review I was going to get. My partner and I were married the following June, in the shop after closing, surrounded by work we'd printed ourselves on the same press. My mother had bought second-hand when I was 11. The invitations had been set in the same typefaces she'd used for her first wedding clients 30 years ago. A few guests asked about the building, having heard pieces of the story. I told them the short version, that we rent from ourselves now, and that it turns out that's a very good arrangement. There's a version of this where I took whatever settlement was on offer, moved on, and let Grafton Street belong to someone else's history. I've thought about that version. It's smaller and more tired, and it ends in a building that never quite fits. But I know how my mother built what she built, the same way she did everything, which was by deciding that the space she occupied was worth defending, and then doing the years of work that the defense actually required. Some people leave a place and spend the rest of their lives putting distance between themselves and where the wound happened. I went back and bought the building it happened in. And then I made it better than it was before, which is the only kind of revenge that has anything left in it after the satisfaction wears off.